Hello, everybody, and welcome to our third art week. Today we're going to be talking about abstract expressionism, the New York School, um, also the other figures that were kind of loosely attached to this movement. First, I want to set the stage a little bit. I first look at the abstract curtain behind me. That's pretty abstract. Uh, I apologize. Um, so, the context of where these artists are coming from. In Europe, during this time period, the mid 20th century, of course, we all know that totalitarianism is taking the world by storm. We've read about this and we'll read more about it. But totalitarianism was not friendly to avant garde artists. In places like Paris, people are being driven out, especially minorities, religious, ethnic minorities being driven out. Even just general countercultural figures are really not welcome. Totalitarianism depends upon this kind of subservience to the one vision of a particular leader. Avant-garde obviously is all about experimentation, about not just conforming. So totalitarians not a fan of avant-garde artists. In fact, in 1942, the Guggenheim, the famous modern art museum in New York City, was opened by an immigrant under just these circumstances. Hitler himself, as many know, was kind of an aspiring artist, fashioned himself to be an artist of sorts. But he was certainly a far afield from the modernist painters that we're looking at today. He famously held exhibitions of their work simply to illustrate exactly how degenerate they were. He really believed that these were a threat to the moral and patriotic fervor that he was trying to create under his regime. So, with that being said, art modernists fled from Europe in large number, and the United States became even stronger as a cultural center as a result of this. There are many mixed feelings about this artwork. I mean, it is often kind of critiqued by people who believe that there should be a subject matter, who don't really understand or don't agree with some of the more avant-garde techniques that were being employed. And there are people on both sides of the camp who also, some believe that this retreat into abstraction, or at least it was perceived to be a kind of retreat into abstraction, delayed the empathetic response that could have been created by more figurative art, that is, art that tried to display something in the real world. People on the other side would argue that the kind of cerebral qualities of modernist art allowed for the freedom of thought and the freedom of expression that was so desperately needed and so horribly lacking in Europe during this time. So let's begin with abstract expressionism. Happens in New York, in the New York School. The principles of this movement are as follows: that they're non-figurative, as I just said. Figurative tries to recreate something that actually exists in the world. They're not even representational. Abstract expressionism does not seek to represent ideas, feelings, thoughts of the artist. Instead, it seeks to do something else with the art process, that it isn't going to be so tied to old ideas of human beings. And it really is abstract expressionism that puts America on the world stage in terms of its art. Until this time, until abstract expressionism, much of the artistic accolade was being given to, obviously, artists in Paris, artists over in Europe generally. We don't read a lot about American artists prior to abstract expressionism, but that all changes in the middle of the century. Abstract expressionism is derivative. It springs from the art movements we talked about last week, or last art week, derives a lot from Surrealism. We'll remember Surrealism was focused on dreams or the unconscious, trying not to be lifelike, but trying to actually authentically spring from the imagination. So there's much in common between abstract expressionism and Surrealism, in that they're not trying to copy the real world or display the real world. Instead, they're trying to get to something more something under the surface of those things, tap into something deeper. If you look at Gorky's The Artist and His Mother in your book, you'll notice that there's also a lot of overlap between abstract expressionism and cubism. In Gorky's painting, space is, you can see, very flat. So there's this kind of multi-dimensional perspective going on where you have to look at it from multiple vantage points. Things that should be three-dimensional are rendered flat. Things that are flat are rendered three-dimensional. There's this idea of fluid motion in place, but also taking shapes and making them as organic or as natural as possible. This was to try and create the effect of humans and vegetable life, where the rocks and humans spring forward from that same place. That there is a basic texture or shape to existence that transcends the kind of divisions that we imagine to exist between us and the world around us. So that's something abstract expressionism really wants to do, is it wants to dig deeper than the kind of binaries that we tend to create between ourselves and the world around us, or ourselves and the world of art. And no one does this more famously, certainly, than Jackson Pollock, probably the best-known artist coming out of the New York school. You recognize his work. I would imagine you would have at least had some passing familiarity with Jackson Pollock. He begins, interestingly, as a regionalist. So we've talked about regionalists. He doesn't stray too far from trying to capture a local flavor in his early work. But as his work progresses, he becomes kind of the seminal, quintessential abstract expressionist. He uses different applications of paint, splattering, dripping. He wasn't trying to hide, and this I think is important, he wasn't trying to hide the process. He wasn't trying to be an artist that disappears and that the work of art stands alone. Rather, he wanted to show how the action of painting is connected to a process that shouldn't be hidden, but it should be appreciated. The process is the thing itself. It's too often we try to disguise the fact that this has been painted, but Pollock wanted us to pay attention to the very quality of being painted, the action of painting. If you look at his painting Guardians of the Secret, there's again, like with Surrealists and Cubists as well, there's a focus on spontaneity. If we carefully craft paintings in order to hide the human involvement in the process, that division is artificial. Instead, Pollock says we should simply let the energies and actions of painting be what they are, and let them produce what they will produce. And so it's a very spontaneous, freeing kind of activity. It's energetic, certainly. You can't look at one of his paintings with the splatters and sprays and drips and not feel a certain motion under the surface. But it's also not really intelligible. It's not about something. It's about the action of painting. And that's really an important thing to note about abstract expressionism, is so often their paintings are not about some other thing. The abstract expression is about painting. It's about the act of painting. There is no need for abstract expressionists, including Pollock, to isolate the creation of art from the final work of art. Those two things are part of existence, and so in order to have a fuller understanding of what it means to be human, we can't hide the work that goes into it. It should be on full display, because in fact that's what matters. It's not that you painted a beautiful sunset and then that what we appreciate is the sunset itself being represented. When you paint a sunset, we should appreciate the beautiful action that went into producing the painting. It's kind of pulling back the curtain, I guess. If you look at White Light from 1954, the other Pollock painting in the book, there's obviously nothing in this painting that is recognizable. There's only sharp contrast between lines and between colors. It's a painting driven exclusively by rhythm and dynamism that literally, and he made sure by trimming the edges, the parameters of his paintings, that every painting of his is always spilling out of the edges, as if the painting goes well beyond the mere frame of the canvas, that the painting is larger and more energetic and more all-consuming than that. So all of Pollock's paintings kind of spray out in all directions and don't know any structure. They won't be put into a box, literally. You can look at some of the colleagues of Pollock. Pollock is, again, the most well-known of the bunch, but Mark Rothko is probably a close second in that regard. He began as a surrealist and eventually found his way into more abstract artwork. So he began kind of trying to portray the unconscious, and then it became much more about the material act of painting. His paintings clearly are not figurative, and they're clearly not representational. You can look at number 15 in your textbook, where there are floating rectangles in the color blue. Here he goes even one step further than Pollock. There's not even any reference to the artistic process. It simply is an image taken out of time and space. It is meant to transcend and tap into some deeper essence. And so in a way, Rothko is a lot like Pollock, but I think Pollock is more about action and energy, and Rothko is more about imagining the essence of a thing, of a color, of a substance, of a shape, and just being able to contemplate that outside of time and space without the burdens of thinking about the context of history and culture and all of these other things. Instead, it kind of stands alone. Related to this, but in some ways departing, is color field painting. I think Frank Stella is probably the best known example in the book. Trying to catch symmetry and similarity in colors, kind of trying to portray the spectrum. Critics would often say it's basically just color swatches sometimes, but supporters would say that there's a great deal more going on there. Repetition, the radiation of color that kind of slowly changes or bleeds into different colors. It's the calming, transcendent kind of oneness of things that color field painting was about. They didn't want to paint a sunset because the beauty is actually in the colors of the sunset, divorced from the concept of the orb, the sun coming up in the distance. I think the difference between abstract expressionism and color field painting is probably one of attitude. Pollock being a very active, energetic painter who wants you to pay attention to the energy, the motion behind things. The color field painters like Frank Stella want you instead to have a calm, meditative experience with the idea of the color or the shape or texture before you. Meanwhile, not all of the art that was happening in this time period is American in origin. In Europe, there is something called figurative abstraction, which is doing much of what we just described. Jean Dubuffet, in the painting in here on page 908, is the Reveler. You can see that it is drawn in a way that is supposed to be childlike. He tries to capture images that seem to come from children, uh, the insane, or the kind of awkward beauty created by self-taught artists who are not overly polished and overly educated on how to paint. And so when you look at the Reveler, you can tell that it seems to be spontaneous. It's very energetic, very full of motion. Usually it's very textured, so it hasn't been polished. It's literally still rough around the edges. And it seems to be something that just happened, that someone sat down and made art and didn't think too much about it. Critics of this mode of art are obviously going to say, well, my 3-year-old can paint something like that. And that's a common kind of critique of this movement. But I think the figurative abstraction movement does tell us something important, as many of the 20th century movements have told us, about how humanity shifts gradually away from some of the older rules and regulations that governed how we did things, how we saw the world. There's a pretty dramatic departure going on here. No longer do we care to just mimic the world around us. There's a fundamental change in our perception of things and in the things that we want to focus on, and a fundamental change in how art really is done. So if you think about the Revelers as being kind of a prime example of this, uh, why would a work of art so unpolished, so rough, so imperfect be meaningful in the age of 2 world wars and in the age of the Great Depression and the age of all these hugely traumatic events in world history? And I think the imperfection of these, or the shifting attention over into something that isn't just the grandeur of Western tradition, makes a lot of sense, because Western traditions at this time seem to be imploding all around them. All of the big meta-narratives and grand narratives about the world that preceded these movements, those grand narratives are starting to seem pretty flimsy. It's hard to believe in progress when you can see some of the barbaric activities of the Second World War, and you see the kind of unbridled greed and power struggles that are going on all around them. I think it's quite natural that artists would start to say, maybe our priorities have been wrong. Maybe we should have been going about this and thinking about things in a little bit of a different way. Maybe there's something even dangerous about following the older models of portraying reality in art. So, I think the take-home point is this abstract expressionism, and on through all of its derivative followers, is a uniquely American style, which I think is important, because we don't spend a lot of time looking at distinctly American styles. It's not as clear a departure. You'll notice that there are many overlaps between things that are said for this week and things that have been said previously. I don't think that it is an entirely original eruption from older ways of doing things, but it does intensify many of the things we've talked about with Cubism and Surrealism. We go even further away from the Enlightenment focus on recreating reality, on trying to have this mathematical precision and balance and perfection in art. We go even further away from that, and we try to access something internal, something beyond the impersonal and rigid domains of reason and artistic training. Reason and artistic training, reason and education led to the Second World War, and so I think at that point people were looking for answers in other places, maybe being more spontaneous, maybe trying to tap into what is in our unconscious. What's wrong with us? Why do we keep having these nightmares together? I think there's a tremendous amount of experimentation, and before casting these artists and their artworks out as being weird or I don't get it or any of these things, I think we have to start at the beginning, start at the root, and understand that these artists are fighting hard against a larger worldview uh, that doesn't seem to be leading humanity towards a better place anymore. If Western progress was ever to be believed as a myth, then by the end of the Second World War, those myths are debunked. And so a huge amount of experimentation and turmoil. It's a horrifying thing for many of these artists and many of the people looking at this art, but it's also a tremendously freeing thing. I think that's the thing about modernist art that keeps bringing me back and keeping me interested, is the horror of trying something totally and dramatically new. This feeling of no one's ever done this before, this feeling, this lack of security, there's no safety net anymore, can be a very scary thing, but it can also be a very hopeful and freeing thing. I mean, it really liberated people to explore things that they had never thought about before, and there's something really astounding about that as well. So I hope you enjoy these paintings, and I look forward to hearing more about your thoughts on them in the discussion forum and in your reflections as well. All right, see you next week.